All right, great. Sandheep is here. Time to start. Thanks for joining this webinar. The title is Perovskite Solar Cells, Advanced Optoelectrical Characterization and Simulations. And we are going to have two speakers, Sandeep Ravishankar and Sandra Jenatsch from Fluxim. Sandeep is a postdoc at Forschungszentrum Jülich in Germany, and will present his work Discerning Rise Time Constant to Quantify Charge Carrier Extraction in Perovskite Solar Cells. Sandeep holds a PhD in Applied Physics and a Master of Science in Nanoscale Science and Technology from the University of Leeds. He received the Walter Benjamin Fellowship and the Grisola Research Grant. His research focus is on the physics of the operation of perovskite solar cells, and is working also on photoanodes for water splitting. His main interest is the development of measurement and analysis method for improved characterization of these devices. And I don't want to spend too much of time, so Sandeep, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Danielle, for the introduction. Let me just share my screen. Yeah, thanks, Danielle, for the introduction, and thanks to Fluxim for the invite. So I'm going to talk about this work that we recently published, Discerning Rise Time Constants to Quantify Charge Carrier Extraction in Perovskite Solar Cells. And this work was done with the following people: Leonard, Sandra, also from Fluxim, and also Genghua and Yumeng, who made the solar cells. Okay, so I'd start off just with the question, why is characterization of the perovskite device physics important? And when you look at the performance parameters in the literature, you see most of the perovskites across different band gaps, they're pretty much close to the theoretical limits. The JC is quite good. The VOC is quite good for lower band gaps, can get better for higher band gaps. But the fill factor is still lacking a little bit. And so the general logic that you get out of this is that you can't arbitrarily make some material modification or passivation in order to improve performance, because the performance is already close to the theoretical limits. So we need to understand the physics of the device and its interfaces really to make any further improvements. And in the case of perovskite solar cells, my main interest is in the effect of the transport layers. So we are in a curious situation where you have a perovskite layer that's pretty good, thin film with high mobilities, greater than 10 centimeters square per volt per second, sandwiched between really thin layers, which are the electron and hole transport layers, which are not that good. So especially in PIN solar cells, you have these organic layers like PCBM, C60, and PTA also, which have much lower mobilities than the perovskite. So this has a significant effect on the performance. You can see here in this plot from Martin Stolterford, the fill factor is significantly affected by the transport layer thickness. And also, of course, the addition of the electron and hole transport layers reduces the quasi-Fermi level splitting through non-radiative recombination. So it looks like these interfaces between the perovskite and the transport layer, and the transport in the transport layers itself is crucial for the performance. And this is exemplified in these simulations. So even if you have really large diffusion lengths in the perovskite layer compared to the thickness, around 300, 350 nanometer, it doesn't really matter if your charge transport layers are not very good. So you can see for lower mobilities of the charge transport layers, you have a big drop in performance parameters. And another curious effect of the transport layers is that the Fermi level splitting is inside the perovskite is coupled to the potential drop across the transport layers. So you can see it in this simulation here at short circuit. There's no voltage. And depending on the mobility in the transport layer, for lower mobilities, you have a higher gradient in the quasi-Fermi level through the transport layers to drive the same short circuit current, which leads to a larger quasi-Fermi level splitting in the perovskite layer. And what does that mean? That means more recombination, because recombination scales exponentially with the quasi-Fermi level splitting. So then you end up in a situation where there is a lot of voltage-dependent recombination that you need to account for, depending on the mobilities and properties of the transport layer. And so the key questions that I'm trying to answer are, can we account for the effect of the transport layers on the perovskite performance? And can we accurately separate transport layer effects from bulk effects, surface effects in typical characterization techniques? And the methods that I'll focus on firstly are the frequency domain small perturbation methods. I'll just give a brief introduction. So basically you have three variables that you can modulate the solar cell with. You have the current, the voltage, and the input photon flux. So what happens in these frequency domain small perturbation measurements is you take the solar cell to a steady state as shown here of these parameters, and then you apply a small AC perturbation. It's usually a sinusoidal perturbation. And this perturbation can be either the voltage or the current or the photon flux itself. And then you can measure the response again, which is any of the two remaining variables. So in this case, in IMPS, you apply a perturbation of the photon flux, and you measure the response, the AC response. And you define something called the transfer function, which is just the AC measured variable divided by the modulated variable. And so then you repeat this for different frequencies. Usually we scan it over a big range, several orders, 1 megahertz to 10 megahertz. And so you can define three different transfer functions from this logic. So the impedance spectroscopy is well known. It's the modulated voltage divided by the modulated current. And IMPS, which is intensity modulated photocurrent spectroscopy, is the modulated current versus the input photon flux. And IMVS, which is the same as IMPS, but instead of measuring the current, you measure the modulated voltage. And the typical representation of this frequency domain spectra is in the form of a real versus imaginary, negative imaginary part of the transfer function. It's sometimes called a Nyquist plot. And then you get some features, which we can discuss a bit later in the talk. And a corresponding method is the other time domain small perturbation method. So these are usually transient photovoltage and transient photocurrent. So here you have the device under test that's held under DC light bias. And it's connected to a load through a series resistance, which is usually the 50 ohm cable. And you have an oscilloscope that's measuring the potential drop across this load resistance. And in case of transient photovoltage, you're measuring only the voltage. So you have a 1 mega ohm load resistance. And in case of transient photocurrent, where you want to measure the current, you have 50 ohm load resistance. And so you apply a small perturbation of photon flux on the device, and you measure either the voltage or the current, depending on TPV, depending on whether you're measuring TPV or TPC. And what you usually see after the pulse is a rise in the voltage or the current, and then a subsequent decay. Okay. In order to understand this slightly better, I've just made a little video here of what happens in a typical TPV measurement. So here is a band diagram of a perovskite solar cell held at open circuit. So you have the electron transport layer here, the absorber, and the whole transport layer. So in order to see it a bit better, I would ask you to just focus on the whole Fermi level here, which is this purple line. So it's steady state, and then there's a increase in the Fermi level splitting because of the photon pulse, and this increases the charge from the absorber is transferred to the transport layers, and you see a rise in the voltage, and then a subsequent decay back down. I'll just play it again. So see a step, charge is transferred there, and then it comes back down here. Okay, so in order to understand this, I will provide a general equation that considers two time constants basically. So it's a rise time constant tau v rise and a decay time constant tau v decay. So it's just a sum of two exponential terms. Yeah. So you'll have to currently believe me that this is a valid equation. We can discuss its validity later, of course, in the questions round. And so just initially, we can kind of make a few understandings of what the TPV is measuring. So it's likely that this, since charge is transferred from the bulk to the transport layer, then the TPV and the TPC likely depend on transport layer mobilities and also bulk and interface recombination parameters as a first order guess. Yeah? Okay, now let's just compare the time and frequency domain spectra. Here are some drift-diffusion simulations from ZFOS. So the TPV and TPC, like I said, is characterized by two time constants, the rise and the decay time constant. And in case of the frequency domain spectra, the typical way of extracting the time constant is finding the peak of the negative imaginary part of the transfer function versus frequency, as shown here. So in case of a Nyquist plot, the real versus imaginary part, you can also just take it from the peak of this arc here. And there's also a transition to a negative real part here, but we can discuss that later. Okay, but the first question that arises out of this is, why do the time domain techniques have two time constants while the frequency domain techniques have only one time constant, right? And in order to explore this further, we made some drift diffusion simulations with different transport layer mobilities, and we checked the TPV and IMVS response. And so in the TPV, you can see for increasing transport layer mobilities, you have a faster rise and a larger magnitude of this rise. And the decay is not that affected by the transport layer mobility. And in case of IMVS, for reducing transport layer mobilities, you see there's a more pronounced transition at high frequencies to a negative real part before it comes back to the origin. I will explain the meaning of that later. And so if you do the typical time constants analysis that I just showed you, okay, you get a rise and a decay time constants from TPV as a function of the transport layer mobility. So you have that, the rise, and then there's a decay. And the IMVS predicts the same decay time. So this matches pretty well. But the question is, where is the rise time constant in the frequency domain data, right? And to explain why this rise time is missing, we can just do a Laplace transform of the TPV two time constant equation that I just showed. And in this case, when the rise time is much faster than the decay time, so this term kind of drops out and you just get the decay time constant from the traditional analysis. Okay, so we can just conclude that we're not able to see the rise time constant from IMVS spectra or generally frequency domain spectra. And the question is how to extract the rise time constant from the data. So to do that, we defined a modified transfer function. I'll just explain the logic a little bit here. So in case of a time domain measurement, you see the absolute value of the voltage here, but you also see the slope of the voltage. You can see if it's increasing or decreasing at each point. But in this frequency domain plot, you can only get the absolute value. You don't really have an idea whether the voltage is increasing or decreasing, right? So there's some information missing in the frequency domain plot just because we have a certain way of plotting the information. And so we just made a really simple, based on this simple logic, we just defined a different kind of a transfer function. So instead of looking at the absolute value of the voltage, we went to dV by dt. And when you do a Laplace transform of that, it just becomes I omega times the voltage. Right. So instead of looking at the IMVS transfer function, which is W, we started looking at I omega times W. Right. And I didn't have a better name, so I just called it M. So in this case, the real part of the M transfer function depends on the imaginary part of the IMVS transfer function, while the imaginary part now depends on the real part of the transfer function. So if we now do the traditional analysis, which is the peak of the negative imaginary part versus frequencies, we would now be focusing on the real part of the IMVS transfer function. Yeah. So let's see what information that gives. And so here you have the traditional imaginary part of the IMVS, which just shows the decay time, as I explained earlier. But now the negative imaginary part of this new modified transfer function is showing both the decay time constants and a peak for the rise time constant. And as you can see, it's switched in magnitude. So the decay time constants here, the peak is negative, but here the rise time constant gives a positive peak. And as I told you, this transfer function is now looking at the real part of the IMVS. So basically this information is embedded in the transition of the real part to negative values of the IMVS transfer function. Yeah. Okay, so now we're able to extract the rise time constant, and as you can see, it now matches pretty well with the rise time constant from TPV. And if we want to get mathematical, you can see that the negative imaginary part of M, now the terms are weighted equally, the rise and decay terms, so there are no terms that drop out while doing the traditional analysis. Okay, good. So now we're able to extract the rise time constant. We achieved our goal, but the question is, what does it mean? Which mechanisms generate the rise and decay time constants, and what information can we get out of it? Right. And for that, we developed an advanced model for the perovskite in addition to the traditional mechanisms of charge injection, recombination. Our model also explicitly accounts for charge transfer from the perovskite to the transport layer. And this is explained in this publication here. I would urge you to go and have a look at it. We cannot go into all the details now, but I'll just give a brief summary. So there is basically an electric field in the transport layer that depends on the built-in voltage and, of course, the external voltage. This is the V electrode here, the voltage at your electrodes. And you have a band offset delta E here. And so the charge extraction velocity from the perovskite to the collecting electrode, in this case, electrons here, that depends on the mobility of the transport layer and the electric field in the transport layer times exponential the band offset. And there is another quantity that comes out of the model called the transport layer resistance, which is similar to a recombination resistance for those who know what it is. It depends exponentially on the applied voltage, so it reduces with applied voltage, but it still depends on this charge exchange velocity, so it's not exactly like a recombination resistance. And finally, another important quantity that drops out of the model is this charge extraction time constant, which is the thickness of the perovskite divided by this charge extraction velocity. So you can just think of it as the time needed to pull out charge from the perovskite through the transport layer and to the collecting electrode. And from this model, we were able to get an equivalent circuit. And the main point of this equivalent circuit, why it's different from everything else, is that it accounts for the difference between the internal voltage, which is this quasi-Fermi level splitting, and the external voltage under illumination. So as I showed you earlier, at short circuit, you can have a big quasi-Fermi level splitting, but you still have zero applied voltage. And this model accounts for that. You see the typical recombination resistance and the chemical capacitance here with the internal voltage and the standard geometric capacitance. But the interesting bit is this R exchange here, which is a voltage dependent resistance, basically, that accounts for the potential drop in the transport layer. And so using this model, we were able to extend our modified transfer function generally to all the other frequency domain methods. So we have the IMBS, as I just showed earlier, then the IMPS. And we also defined it for the impedance, but it turns out for the impedance, you just need to subtract the series resistance for this method to work. And so we were able to extract the rise and decay time constants for all the methods as a function of DC open circuit voltage. And yeah, I know these plots have a lot of things, but I would just tell you to focus on the blue and the red dots here. So the blue ones are the decay time constants that are extracted from this equivalent circuit, and the red ones are the rise time constants. And the other dashed lines are just different RCs that that are coupled together, and they sort of dominate certain points in the time constants, right? And as you can see, most of the rise time constants, these red dots, they're dominated by this tau exchange. You can see the purple dashed lines, which is basically modeling charge extraction. You can see it in IMVS here and IMPS also at certain open circuit voltages. And in case of the decay time, you have recombination, this tau recombination green dashed line at high open circuit voltages. And at lower open circuit voltages, you start seeing this R recombination times CG. So this is the recombination limited by reinjection of charge from the electrodes, right? So basically, we can summarize this by saying different time constants are expressed due to the voltage dependence of the resistances and capacitances. So it depends which DC condition you are in. And the rise time generally corresponds to charge extraction in these methods. And the decay time is a combination of actual recombination or recombination limited by charge injection from the electrodes. And in case of IMPS, you have also this series resistance effect where it couples with the geometric capacitance here, as you can see, RSCG. Okay, influence of the mobile ions. So all my previous simulations were basically without mobile ions. And of course, we wanted to check if mobile ions have a significant effect on our developed method. And again, I don't want to go too deep into this. We can discuss this later. But you can see the method works pretty well even with ions. These are band diagrams for different ionic densities. And you see, since the charge extraction time constant depends on the electric field in the transport layer, for lower light intensities, you see a bigger electric field in the transport layer, this potential drop here compared to this potential drop here, which means the model correctly predicts that this rise time constant, which is charge extraction, becomes faster for lower light intensities. You can see from here, it transitions lower. So that's a good validation of our model. And we can basically summarize that the model works well even in the case of having a density of mobile ions in the perovskite. Okay, with all this analysis, we finally were able to apply it to experimental data. Here's the JV curve of our 1.68 electron volt samples. And so we did the IMVS and TPV at different open circuit voltages. You can see this typical transition to the negative real part that contains the rise time constant, as I said earlier. And here's the transformed transfer function, and you can see the rise and decay time constants really nicely in the IMVS data. And of course, in the TPV, you can see the rise of the voltage and the subsequent decay. And we use this equation to get the rise and decay time constants for TPV. And here they are, you can see, they show a pretty good agreement with each other. And now the question was how to interpret this, which time constants correspond to charge extraction recombination. So we just use this formula. So tau is tau naught exponential QVOC with this theta factor here. I'll just explain what that means. And so in case of an intrinsic perovskite layer, which has been proved a lot for our devices, the tau in case of recombination, a radiative recombination, so second order, that would be proportional to exponential minus q VOC by 2 kT. And in case of recombination limited by the capacitive reinjection, again, you would have an exponential minus q VOC by 2 kT. And in case of charge extraction, it has a power law dependence on the VOC, so you wouldn't see a big evolution in a semi-log plot here. And this is basically what we are seeing. You see the TPV tau rise is not really evolving much, which gives a large theta factor, which means it is behaving as we expect the charge extraction time constant to behave, while the decay times are showing theta values close to 2, which means it's either radiative recombination or this capacitive reinjection term. But as you can see here, most of these data points are well below the ones on VOC, so it definitely isn't radiative recombination. You would expect that to occur at much higher open circuit voltages or Fermi level splitting. So we concluded that the decay times basically are recombination limited by charge reinjection from the geometric capacitance. So it's not a real recombination lifetime, but the rise time does correspond to charge extraction. And in order to quantify the quality of our transport layer, we also wanted to extend the typical JV curve equation that is used commonly. So this is the standard JV curve. You have the generation and the recombination term, and here's the reverse saturation current density. So it's a standard balance of generation and recombination. But in case of these non-ideal transport layers that don't extract charge efficiently, this can be extended to this equation here. And it is basically here you have the same terms, the balance of generation and recombination, but you have a prefactor here that depends on the charge extraction time constant, as I told you earlier here. And it also depends on the recombination time constant. So if recombination is really fast, then this whole term becomes much bigger, the denominator, and the entire JV curve is reduced by a factor. While if charge exchange or charge extraction is much faster compared to recombination, then this whole thing becomes 0 and your prefactor is 1, and you have the standard JV curve that is limited only by bulk recombination. So a figure of merit, FOM, when this figure of merit is 1, you have perfect charge extraction, and when it's less than 1, you have non-ideal charge extraction. Okay, so we already know the charge exchange lifetime from the rise time constants, but the recombination time constants, as I told you earlier, are limited by the geometric capacitance. So we don't know the real recombination lifetime. How do we determine that? As you might guess, we did photoluminescence measurements, transient photoluminescence on this stack here. But since we wanted to avoid the geometric capacitance effect, we didn't put electrodes. And here we got some nice TRPL differential lifetimes for different Fermi level splittings. And now we could calculate this figure of merit, which depends on the ratio of the charge extraction lifetime coming from these IMVS and TPV rise times with the recombination lifetime from transient photoluminescence. And here you have the figure of merit. So this figure of merit is very close to 1, even at open circuit for both IMVS and TPV. So we can conclude that the large value of this FOM implies that it's likely that there's a significant electric field in the transport layers that allows fast charge extraction, even at values close to the ones on open circuit voltage. Okay, and with that, I'm at the end of my talk. So some conclusions. I think I've just shown you that the same information is embedded in the time domain and frequency domain methods, but they are in different forms. So that's why we have to define a modified transfer function in order to extract some information which is hidden in the traditional analysis of frequency domain spectra. And this hidden information is the rise time constant here and can be extracted using the modified transfer function. And this modified transfer function is defined for both for IMVS, IMPS, and also impedance. So it can be used generally across the board. And we also developed a voltage-dependent figure of merit that determines losses due to non-ideal charge extraction in perovskite layers. So this figure of merit applies only for the case where you are limited by your transport layers and not by your bulk. And that depends on the ratio of the charge extraction lifetime and the recombination lifetime, which is in ideal conditions, the rise time constant divided by the decay time constant. But you need to be careful in assigning, especially the decay times to actual recombination, because your geometric capacitance also plays a lot of effect in full devices. And finally, we concluded that the large figure of merit values close to 1 implies that there's a significant electric field in the transport layers that allows fast charge extraction in these conditions. This entire work was based on this paper that we recently published here in EES, but there are other aspects as well in my talk. So the model that we developed is explained in this PRX energy paper, and also in general, the effect of the transport layer capacitances and its interplay with the resistances is explained in this paper. So please have a look if you want to get more information. And with that, I'm open for questions.
Thanks, Sandeep. This was great. A lot of useful information. There is indeed a question. How to calculate the lifetimes of charge carriers in TPV and TPC?
So as I said, you can use this equation here that takes into account the fact that there's an exponential rise and an exponential decay. So in this case, we fitted the TPV and the TPC data with this equation to get the rise and decay time constant. Yes, so what's typically done in the community is they look at only the decay times. The rise time is usually not analyzed. It might also be due to experimental limitations, but yeah, if the rise also has important information.
Yeah. There's also another question, then we will move forward. How does this picture change when you consider doped contacts that still have low mobility?
When you consider doped contacts, is that the question?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, so when you have doped contacts, I think it makes the situation much better, because then you don't have such a big effect of the low mobilities of the transport layers. But again, yeah, so I would not expect a significant effect in the case of, for example, NIP devices, but it's definitely still there. So the transport layers, as I showed earlier, doesn't just depend on the mobility, but it also depends on this band offset. So, and depending on your fabrication conditions, your band offset can be really bad and you're not extracting charge. So it's not just the doping that plays a role, it's also the band offsets.
Yeah. Okay, if there are any other questions, you can write it here in the chat. Now it's pretty late, so we are going to move forward with Sandra Jenatsch. Sandra is the R&D manager at Fluxim, and she has a PhD in material science from the PFL and a Master of Science in Physics from the ETH in Zurich. Sandra will present some advanced characterization techniques that are helpful to understand the physics of perovskite solar cells. Please, Sandra.
Yeah. Thanks, Daniele, for the introduction. I hope you can see the slides. So I want to show you today a bit of electro-optical characterization of perovskite solar cells, but it also includes a bit of simulations, as Sandeep also showed that it's highly important. To start with, think I don't need to explain this chart. Perovskite solar cells are really interesting in terms of efficiency, and also because of different applications. And the one thing I would like to focus on today is that they're electronic ionic devices. So these ions, they play a crucial role in the operation, and we have to consider them both in the analysis and also in the device simulations. What do these ions impact? So what clearly is there and what everyone knows is this rate-dependent JV curve. So depending on the scan rate, you see a smaller or bigger hysteresis effect. But there has also been other reports, for example, that in steady state operation, when you switch from VOC to short circuit, you see a loss in current density, and this effect leads to a considerable loss in power conversion efficiency of up to 8%. But also in degradation, or let's say stability data, you see an effect of the ions, mainly that there is some partial recovery effect thanks to the ion that relax. So the ions are important, and of course there are a lot of characterization techniques to characterize ionic charge carriers. As I mentioned before already, very straightforward is to measure the JV curve at different scan speeds, and then you see a different difference between the power conversion efficiency in forward and reverse, or also called hysteresis, depending on the scan speed. But there are also other methods, for example, this bias-assisted charge extraction, where you see the ions generating a very slow time constant, and this can be used to quantify ionic charges. There have also been reports on open circuit voltage decay, where you see the effect here in the simulation that increasing ion density leads to an increase in this delayed open circuit voltage decay. Then furthermore, you see it also in impedance spectroscopy. Here, a capacitance frequency plot where you see an increasing density leads to an increase in this low frequency part of the capacitance. And finally, also in IMPS, as Sandeep introduced earlier today, this low frequency peak here is directly related to the ionic conductivity. So there are a lot of techniques out there, and today I would like to show you two studies where we used some of these techniques to learn a bit more about ionic parameters in fabrication and also in general in perovskite devices. So to start with, I would like to present this paper, or part of this paper, where in a collaboration with Universidad Pablo de Olavide, we looked at the impact of fabrication of mobile ionic parameters. And so this was done in a collaboration project with Juan Anta and in this scale-up project. So our system that we looked at was this formamidinium-based perovskite, and we added on purpose some excess of this FA site into the perovskites. So this is not new. This has been done earlier, and there has been various reports in literature that, for example, it improves the VOC due to, for example, a reduction of the barrier and the interface recombination, but also in terms of stability. They reported that it leads to an improved photostability. For example, these excess ions that they would compensate intrinsically present mobile iodine vacancies. So in this study, we wanted to look at the systematic variation with different concentrations of this FAI excess, and then analyze the performance, short-term stability, and then as a new thing, link it to the ionic parameters by electro-optical characterization. So let's look first at the characterization. So here we see the JV curve as a function of this excess. The black line is the one without any excess of FAI. And as we can see here, we have first an increase in performance and then a decrease with increasing excess. And the best cells are about the ones with 1% or sometimes the one with 1.5%. In terms of short-term stability, so a few minutes, we see that the stabilization of the PC takes longer with more excess FAI, but then they're also slightly more stable. So a certain excess also stabilizes this power conversion efficiency over time. Yeah. So in order to analyze what happens inside the device, and especially in the ionic parameters, we perform this electrical impedance spectroscopy with bias light, as Sandeep already explained earlier. So here we see this Nyquist plot that he showed, and here we see the imaginary part versus frequency, just another representation of the data. And what we can see here in the low frequency part, which is the one attributed to the ions, we see a shift of this peak to higher frequency, the more excess FAI we add into this. And also in the Nyquist plot, we can see a change of these semicircle sizes. This low frequency part has been attributed earlier in this publication in using device simulations to an increase in diffusivity of the ionic charge carriers. And this is basically what we also see here. And then also we observe that the diffusivity seems to correlate with this lower JSC that we see, and also the lower stabilization. So we want to look at inside the device and learn a bit more about why this happens. So we use the electro-optical device simulations using ZFOS. We build our stack in the simulation, and we basically check the impedance spectroscopy as a function of ionic parameters. So if we look at these two plots, the simulation, we see that both with the increase in ion density as well as with an increase in ion mobility, we see a shift of this low frequency peak to the right-hand side. And well, this is not surprising. This is what I showed you before. But now we want to just change a bit the view to look at the data in another view, looking at this Nyquist plot. We interestingly see that only if we change the ion concentration, we actually see a change of these Nyquist plots and the semicircle sizes. And this is what we see in the experiment. So from this comparison, we can conclude that only if you change the ion density, you actually can reproduce these effects that we see in the experiment, whereas with change in mobility, you cannot reproduce it. So we also wanted to check whether this can also explain the JV simulation or the JV data. And indeed, qualitatively, we see the same trends. So we see when you add more ions, you see a drop in JSC and also a slight reduction in, or a pronounced reduction in fill factor. And at the bottom is just, again, the impedance data. And now, thanks to the simulation, we can also have a look inside the device. And here we see the potential as a function of voltage and for two different ion concentrations. And well, it's pretty simple. The increase in ion density leads to a screening of the field. And so the extraction is hindered in case of the higher ion density. And so the short circuit current is lower and also the fill factor. Okay, this is it. In the second part, I would like to briefly show you the photo effect of ionic charge carriers. This has been done by Andreas Schiller, our computational scientist who just finished his PhD recently, and I performed some characterization for him, so I was allowed to share this nice preliminary data set. So this capacitance frequency plots as a function of illumination is something that you've seen many times before, probably. You have this low frequency rise that is attributed to the ions, and as soon as you switch on the light, you see this pronounced increase in capacitance. We'll not discuss conductance and the Nyquist plot, but basically this is something that is very well known. There has been various reports how to explain this behavior, like an increase in dielectric constants or modulated electronic interfaces, a lot of different hypotheses. If we check in a very simple device simulation, even with a constant mobility, constant mobility and ionic parameters that are known from literature, we can already qualitatively reproduce this increase when we increase the light intensity. So you see qualitatively this agrees very well. However, there has been clear evidence that there should be a photo effect on the ion conductivity. So we digged a bit deeper into this and looked at simulations again, varying, for example, in the model, just the illumination, or changing together with the illumination also the ion mobility. So this would correspond to a photoactivation of the ion mobility. And as a second test, we also checked what happens if we change with the illumination the ion concentration. And at first looking at these graphs, they look pretty similar. So you see a bit of a change in the low frequency part, but you cannot really tell much about the differences yet, and does not deduce whether there is any photo effect on the mobility or concentration, or whether it's just the illumination that is changing. So to look in more detail, Andreas developed this method and looked at this dashed line as a function. Well, as a function of illumination intensity, he looked at the capacitance. So we look at this in a different form. We subtract from this frequency where we see the capacitance, the dark one, and plot it as a function of illumination intensity. And so the same data here shown for these three cases. You see that there is a tiny but a noticeable change. If you have just the illumination change, a constant mobility, constant ion density with illumination, you see that there is a change of slope from a smaller slope to a bigger slope at high intensities, whereas it's the opposite for the two other cases. So we said, okay, if there is a photo effect on the ionic concentration or the mobility, we should see this based on this change of slopes. And well, we did not do yet too many experiments, but we have done some measurements on a solaronic cell as reported herein. And here you see the measured capacitance frequency analyzed in the same way. And basically there is indication that indeed the slope here is higher and then it gets smaller for lower light intensities, which would indeed correspond to one of these two cases where we see a photoactivation effect on mobility and concentration. So this is preliminary. We want to do a bit more experiments here, and also happy to hear your feedback about this. With this, I will be at the end of my talk. I hope I could show you how ionic charges affect the performance of devices, and they can be characterized by various electro-optical characterization methods. In the first study, we looked at FAI excess and how it affects the JV. Could attribute this to the increased ion density in the perovskite layer due to this FAI excess. And in the second study, I showed you how to look at capacitance frequency data with illumination, and that there seems to be a photo effect on the mobility or the density due to the illumination. And with this, I would just like to acknowledge again these two people that did the main part of the work, Juan and Andreas, and of course funding, and you for your attention.
This was amazing, Sandra. Just a quick question from my side. Can you comment about the JV hysteresis? I mean, do you see a systematic change with increasing FAI, and can you reproduce it in the model or something?
Yes, we tried. It's a bit difficult. So here you see the experimental data. So the degree of hysteresis, we defined it as, according to this formula. A positive degree of hysteresis would correspond to the regular behavior, as the reverse is higher than the forward scan. And indeed, there is a shift with increasing FAI. The hysteresis gets lower, gets closer to zero. And as we saw this, we could attribute this to a higher ion density. And this is qualitatively also happening in the simulation. So when we start from no ions, of course, we don't have any hysteresis. And if we have a small amount, we actually have a larger hysteresis at this fixed scan speed. And then if we increase the ion density, so for example, to this pink or the green curve, we actually get rid of the hysteresis again. And this is in line with what happens when we add this FAI. But unfortunately, the part in the reverse part or the inverted hysteresis is not yet reproduced well in the simulation.
I'm not sure if Sandheep is there, but there is a question from Laura. She's asking, could you apply your model also to other perovskite solar cells architectures and different layouts?
Yes, as long as the perovskite bulk is not limiting the performance. Yeah, so the main assumption in our model is that the diffusion length in the bulk of the perovskite is much bigger compared to its thickness. So most of the limitations are coming from the transport layer. So if that assumption is still valid, then yes, the model is still valid.
Great. And the last one, what's the basic difference between a steady state transient PL and a transient PL technique?
Okay. Okay, so transient photovoltage is a small perturbation method. So you take it to a steady state and you apply a small perturbation where the magnitude is much smaller compared to the DC steady state condition. So that allows you to mathematically make higher order processes. Also, you can make it linear. So that's the main advantage. So in TRPL, it's a large signal modulation. So essentially, like exponential terms, etc., in your equation still remain exponential. You can't really linearize it. That's the difference.
Yeah. Okay, thanks to everyone. This was great. I've seen there are several hands, but we are running late and it's better to close here. I suggest you get in contact with Sandheep or Sandra if you have any other questions. And thanks a lot. In 1 month, there is going to be another webinar, and soon we are going to share you the details. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.